You remember our video, Who Killed Pancho Villa? Today we open the second case file. Emiliano Zapata, officially killed in a hail of bullets at Chinameca, yet whole towns in Morelos swear he survived. So what really happened that day? Lower your voice, because Latin America whispers too. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Laura. Myths, history, and real cases, no filler, always backed by sources. Subscribe, and each week another secret comes to light. We already talked about Pancho Villa. In our video on the mysterious circumstances surrounding his assassination, we opened the case file of a death full of bullets, betrayal, and unanswered questions. But if Villa was the thunder of the north, today we have to look south to a man who turned into a myth on horseback, Emiliano Zapata. Officially, the Mexican government says he died on April 10, 1919, gunned down at the hacienda of Chinameca. They photographed his corpse, showed it off, and buried him. Case closed. And yet, in Morelos, there are still elders who say something different, that Zapata didn't fall there, that he escaped, that he kept riding in the mountains. So today, from our Latin American perspective, from the very soil he fought for, we're going to open the file on the mystery of Emiliano Zapata. What really happened at Chinameca, and why did his death turn into legend? To understand why Zapata becomes such a powerful ghost, we have to start where everything began, with the land. Emiliano Zapata Salazar was born in 1879 in Ananequilco, a small village in Morelos whose name in Nahuatl means place where the water flows. That's not just a poetic detail. These were fertile lands, crossed by a river, worked by peasants since before the Spanish arrived. His father was a mestizo peasant who trained and sold horses. His family wasn't rich, but they weren't totally landless either. They had a small plot, a stone and adobe house, access to communal fields, and they rented other plots from the local hacienda. In theory, there was a fragile balance. The hacienda took the sugarcane, the peasant kept his corn and his animals. But when Emiliano was a child, that balance was shattered. During the Porfiriato, the long dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, the law and the gun both stood on the side of the big landowners. With bought judges and armed rural police, the hacienda started swallowing up the old communal lands. One day, so the story goes, young Emiliano found his father crying because they had lost their orchard. There was no lawyer or judge willing to defend them. The boy walked up, looked his father in the eye, and promised that one day he would take those lands back and stop the haciendas from expanding. That promise, made in a village of maybe 400 people, would haunt his whole life and lead him straight to Chinameca. At 17, Zapata was orphaned and had to take care of his brothers and sisters. Very early on, he became a problem for those above and a solution for those below. In 1897, he took part in a peasant protest against a hacienda that had grabbed village lands. He was arrested, pardoned, and then drafted into the army to get him out of the way. He served a few months, was discharged to a landowner who wanted him to train horses, and as soon as he could, he went right back to organizing his people. He was a skilled horseman and trainer, but most importantly, a good neighbor. In 1909, his fellow villagers elected him president of the local defense board. First, he tried what you're supposed to do: talk to the landowners, negotiate, and ask for documents. Nothing. When he saw that the law only worked for the bosses, he changed tactics. With a group of peasants, he occupied the lands the haciendas had taken and redistributed them among the villagers. At the same time, Mexico was boiling. At the end of the 19th century, around 71% of the population lived in the countryside, but about 97% of the land was owned by 1% of the population. Diaz had been re-electing himself for decades through fraud. Landless peasants and powerless middle classes were filling up with anger. In 1910, a landowner from the north with liberal ideas, Francisco Fermadero, got tired of losing rigged elections, fled to the United States, and from exile called for revolution. And here is where the paths of two legends cross. In the north, Pancho Villa; in the south, Emiliano Zapata. If you've watched our Villa video, you already know that the Centaur of the North built a nearly professional army, the División del Norte, buying weapons in the United States and moving trains and troops through the desert. Zapata was the opposite. His power was rooted in the soil, in the cornfields and sugarcane of Morelos. His soldiers were peasants who farmed with rifles on their shoulders, went to fight when called, and returned to the plow when the shooting stopped. In 1911, Zapata's men took the city of Cuautla, cut the road to the capital, and blew a hole in Diaz's regime. Very soon, the dictator resigned and sailed to Europe. Madero entered Mexico City in triumph. Zapata entered Cuernavaca with 5,000 men. It finally seemed like that promise Emiliano had made to his father was going to come true. Revolution, new laws, lands restored. But then came the first great betrayal, not with bullets, but with speeches. Zapata met with Madero and asked him to pressure the provisional government to give land back to the ejidos, the communal village lands. Madero, moderate and obsessed with legality, told him to wait, to disarm his men, that he could personally help him buy land instead of taking it back. For Zapata, that was unacceptable. He began to disarm his fighters, but when the government sent troops against the peasants anyway, he realized that without armed pressure, there would be no justice. So he did something that forever separated him from the politicians of the drawing room. Together with a schoolteacher, Otilio Montaño, he wrote the Plan of Ayala. In that document, simple and full of moral outrage, he declared that Madero had failed the revolution, proposed naming a provisional president until new elections, and above all demanded the restitution of stolen lands. Landowners who refused to give up at least a third of their property would be expropriated without compensation. On top of that program, Zapata adopted a slogan that still appears on banners and murals today, Tierra y Libertad, or Land and Liberty, and that other phrase attributed to him, even if historians argue about the exact wording, it is better to die on your feet than live on your knees. It sounded more like a sentence than a slogan. As the revolution tangled itself up, the system struck back with violence. In 1913, General Victoriano Huerta, backed by Diaz loyalists, betrayed and murdered Madero. Huerta, who had already led brutal campaigns against the Zapatistas, became dictator. In the north, the constitutionalist forces of Venustiano Carranza and Pancho Villa rose against him. In the south, Zapata kept fighting, trusting neither Huerta nor the moderates from the north. The result was a civil war longer and bloodier than the one that had toppled Diaz. In the end, the northern coalition defeated Huerta, but instead of peace, another conflict exploded, this time among revolutionaries themselves. In 1914, the Convention of Aguascalientes was called to decide the country's future. Villa's and Zapata's forces were the majority. Villa refused to go to Mexico City, so the convention moved to Aguascalientes, and there the Zapatistas treated the Plan of Ayala almost like a sacred text. Carranza refused to submit to the convention and retreated to Veracruz. A new war broke out. On one side, Carranza's forces, on the other, the armies of Villa and Zapata, known as conventionists. 2 weeks later came one of the most iconic scenes of the revolution, Zapata and Villa entering the National Palace together. In our video about Villa, we already talked about that general from the north. Here, in the capital, people saw something different in the Zapatistas. Peasants going door to door, humbly asking for food and drink instead of pillaging mansions and assaulting women. That day, Villa and Zapata promised to fight together until they put a civilian in the presidential chair, and Villa accepted the Plan of Ayala. But that alliance was as symbolic as it was fragile. Villa went off to fight big battles in the Bajío. Zapata returned to Morelos to supervise land commissions, distribute hacienda lands, try to build sugar cooperatives and rural credit banks, and create a new order from below. He didn't care about ruling Mexico. He cared about his people sowing in peace. That decision, to stay in Morelos and distrust everyone else, would be key to his fate. While the north burned, Álvaro Obregón, Carranza's main general, defeated Villa in devastating battles like Celaya in 1915. Zapata did not cut Carranza's supply lines, nor did he launch decisive offensives outside his region. Suddenly, the South found itself alone against a government that called itself revolutionary, but saw Zapata as a problem. In 1917, Carranza promulgated a new constitution with social rights, including articles about land. On paper, it was a legal revolution. On the ground, peasants in Morelos were still living war and repression. Zapata resisted in the mountains, more and more isolated. For the new state, the caudillo of the South was no longer an awkward ally. He was an obstacle. And that brings us to 1919, to the moment when history and mystery meet under the sun of Morelos. At the start of that year, Carranza's troops held the towns and cities of Morelos, but couldn't destroy the Zapatistas in the Sierra. General Pablo González, commander of government forces in the state, decided that military pressure wasn't enough. He needed a trap. The instrument would be one of his own officers, Colonel Jesús Guajardo. According to the official story, in March 1919, Gonzales had Guajardo arrested for going drinking while he was supposed to be attacking Zapatistas. Zapata heard about it and saw an opportunity. If he could get Guajardo to switch sides, he could retake key towns. On March 21, he sent him a letter inviting him to join the Zapatista cause. But Gonzales intercepted the letter. In front of Guajardo, he humiliated him, showed him the invitation, and offered a sinister deal. Right back to Zapata pretending he wanted to defect, earn his trust, and then lead him into an ambush. Guajardo agreed. A kind of macabre theater began. Zapata, cautious by nature, decided to test the supposed deserter. On April 1st, he ordered Guajardo to mutiny against the federal army. Guajardo complied, at least in appearance. On April 8th, Zapata told him to occupy the town of Jonacatepec and execute any Zapatista who had gone over to the government side. Guajardo did it. In Emiliano's eyes, this man was burning his bridges with the regime. There was no going back. He seemed like the perfect ally. That same day, the two men met at the Pastor train station. As an offering, Guajardo gave Zapata a beautiful chestnut-colored horse known as Ace of Gold. Picture the scene, the Caudillo of the South, a lifelong horseman, receiving this gift from his new ally. Zapata insisted that Guajardo come with him to his headquarters for dinner with the other rebel leaders, but the colonel slipped away, saying he had to go to the Chinameca hacienda to inspect his ammunition so that General Gonzales wouldn't confiscate it. Zapata spent the night in the mountains. The next morning, Thursday, April 10th, he decided to ride to Chinameca to meet Guajardo. This is where the official narrative and popular suspicions start to diverge. Around midday, Zapata descended toward the hacienda, riding his new horse, Ace of Gold, with only a small escort. Outside the hacienda, he saw tents pitched, soldiers lined up, and strange movement. In one of the tents, he spoke with Guajardo. He'd heard rumors that federal troops were nearby, so before trusting completely, he rode out again with his men to scout the area. He found nothing. At some point, he had to decide whom to believe. When he returned, around 1:30 in the afternoon, he met his private secretary, Feliciano Palacios. They decided to go together to the hacienda for lunch with Guajardo. Only 10 men rode with him as an escort. Zapata urged Ace of Gold forward and approached the main gate. Soldiers of the 15th Regiment stood there in his honor, lined up as if for a welcome ceremony. At that crucial moment, everything came down to a signal. According to the most famous version, a bugle sounded, a prearranged call. That sound, which in other contexts means form ranks, here meant open fire. The soldiers raised their rifles and shot at point-blank range. Zapata fell. His escort tried to react. Some died, others fled. Feliciano Palacios lay dead beside his chief. Jesús Guajardo had fulfilled his role. Emiliano Zapata's body was loaded up and taken to Cuautla. There, at police headquarters, they arranged the corpse for the photographs the government felt it needed. Zapata, even dead, was dangerous. The state needed to convince the entire country that the Attila of the South was gone forever. In those photos, you've likely seen them. He lies with his sombrero on, his mustache still, his body surrounded by soldiers. These are the images repeated in schoolbooks and murals. Proof, the state said, that it was in control. But that, for many people, is where the real mystery begins. For the government, the photos close the case. Dead, displayed, buried in Cuautla's cemetery. For the people of Morelos and the surviving Zapatistas, the images raised doubts. Many peasants who swore they knew his face well insisted the corpse didn't look quite like Emiliano, that the mustache was off, that something wasn't right. Others who accepted it was him still asked why such a theatrical performance was necessary, intercepted letters, staged mutiny, a gift horse, a bugle call, a hail of bullets. Who needed that spectacle of death? The most uncomfortable answer is this. It wasn't the Spanish, it wasn't the French, it wasn't some foreign invader. Zapata was killed on orders of a government that called itself revolutionary, headed by Venustiano Carranza, planned by General Pablo Gonzales, and carried out by Colonel Guajardo. The revolution was devouring its own children. And when a movement betrays the man who embodies its most radical promises, legend is inevitable. From then on, stories multiplied in Morelos about a Zapata who did not die there. People claimed to have seen him years later, older but alive, in the mountains. Tales arose of a silent rider appearing at night on a white horse, watching over the sugarcane fields. And even though historically almost everything points to him dying that day, no leader can hide forever without leaving a trace. For us on this channel, the point isn't to invent a cheap conspiracy theory, but to understand why the people needed to believe Zapata kept writing. After his death, the Zapatistas kept fighting a while longer. In 1920, Álvaro Obregón rose up against Carranza, overthrew him, and took the presidency. To pacify Morelos, he struck a deal with Gildardo Magaña, the new Zapatista leader, integration into the new state in exchange for positions and real agrarian reform. The big sugar haciendas in Morelos were destroyed. Land was redistributed as ejidos, communal properties. Many Zapatista veterans became local authorities. Some followed Emiliano's spirit, others became new bosses inside the same system. Zapata's dream was half fulfilled, with conditions and bureaucracy, and with him already in the grave or in the mountains, depending on whom you ask. Over time, the institutionalized revolution turned Zapata into a stamp, a mural, an avenue name. In the 1940s and 50s, land reform slowed, industrialization and urban life took over. Peasant protests returned, and another Zapatista, Ruben Jaramillo, was killed by the army in 1962. Decades later, in 1994, when indigenous people and peasants in Chiapas took up arms, they chose a very clear name for their army, Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation. They didn't pick a president's name or a desk general. They picked the peasant from Morelos who, according to the official version, died in a hail of bullets at Chinameca, but who, in popular memory, never stopped fighting. Today, Zapata appears in murals, t-shirts, graffiti, and protest banners. For many, he's no longer a man of flesh and blood, but a pure symbol: land, rebellion, dignity. And that brings us back to the question we opened this case with. What is the real mystery of Emiliano Zapata? He died in Chinameca. That is clear. The mystery is why killing him was not enough. How a peasant from Morelos ended up living longer in the people's memory than all the men who signed his death sentence. Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata were two popular caudillos betrayed by gunfire, each with his own dark file. Whether he died exactly the way the government said in 1919, with photos and a bugle call, whether he somehow escaped Chinameca, or whether the system had to kill him and then resurrect him as a secular saint to control his memory. Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, two popular caudillos betrayed in gunfire, each with a dark case file. In our video about Villa, I showed you how the bullets that killed him in Parral created more questions than answers. Today, we've seen how the ambush at Chinameca turned Zapata into a ghost. Now it's your turn. In your family, have you ever heard someone say Zapata didn't die at Chinameca? If you could know the absolute truth about only one of these two cases, would you choose Pancho Villa or Emiliano Zapata? Thank you for walking these hidden paths with me. If this story unsettled you, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. The search for Latin America's darkest corners has only just begun.